Yeah, now in this very quick video is group feedback from the assessment on enslavement that you did prior to the half term. As you can see, you've been tested on two things. First of all, AO1, which is your knowledge and understanding of the past, and AO3, your ability to evaluate and analyse interpretations of the past and how events or periods of history have been remembered differently by different people. So the average mark in section A, which was the Socrative quiz, was 8 out of 10, well done. And the average mark in section B was 14 out of 18. So as you can see, as a class on the whole, we've performed very well in this assessment. And there are some really pleasing scores in this class, so well done. What I'm going to do now is go through each section and identify those areas that we found most difficult in the assessment. So in section A, the two questions that received the fewest correct answers were questions number 2 and number 6. So if we look at the average mark as 8 out of 10, these were the questions that were most likely to prevent you from getting 10 out of 10. So in question number 2, the first transatlantic slave voyages began in which era? That is the Tudor era. Sir John Hawkins is the individual from England who is credited with the first enslavement of West Africans that we have recorded. And so the answer for question 2 was A, the Tudor period, which you will know a lot of from your learning in year 8. And then question number 6, one method of selling enslaved Africans was at an auction. What was the other method called? Well done to those people who said a scramble. So an auction is where an individual would be placed on a stand in front of prospective buyers, and people would bid for that person, for that individual. The other method was a scramble, and that is when an individual was sold as part of a group and enslaved at one time. And scrambles tended to be less organised and more traumatic because of the rush and the panic that a scramble involved. Then we get to section B, and questions 1 and 2 were the best answered of the 4 questions. The only time where people tended to get something wrong in question 1 is where they've mixed up interpretations A and B. They've not read the question correctly, because it's what does interpretation B argue about slavery, and the correct answers were 1 and 5, that the enslaved enjoyed their time on the plantation and that they were not rushed, because the interpretation is the Mammy Harriet interpretation, not the one from Solomon Northup. And then question number 2, how do they differ? Well done to those people who use those phrases, harsh view and benign view of slavery, because interpretation A talks about how difficult life was for people on the plantations, whereas B sort of sugarcoats it and gives us the benign view and talks about examples where slaves might have been better treated than we might expect. Marks for question 2 are awarded 1 mark for correctly identifying a difference per interpretation, and then an additional mark for an accurate and relevant quote from each interpretation. So if you've managed to identify the argument of each and support each with a quote, you've earned yourselves 4 marks out of 4 for question 2. As I said, these were the 2 questions where we did best. It's questions 3 and 4 where marks tended to be lost. So let's move on to those now. Okay, a really important phrase in question 3 is it tells you to use the interpretations and your contextual knowledge, and it would be better if I used a highlighter here rather than the pen to block it out. And your contextual knowledge. Lots of people got 3 marks out of 4 because they had a really good idea of the provenance of these 2 individuals and didn't back it up with some simple supporting knowledge. So essentially what we've got in question 3 is we've got Solomon Northup, who was born free, who was kidnapped and taken to a plantation, and he was enslaved for 12 years. Whereas the second interpretation is written by the daughter of a slave owner after the Civil War, and we can see the different purposes. What Solomon Northup wants to make his audience aware of is the horrors of slavery, whereas in interpretation B, what Susan Smedes wants to do is essentially clear her father's name and give people the impression that enslavement wasn't as bad as people had made out. And if you've done that and talked about provenance in detail, you've got yourself 3 marks out of 4. That additional mark comes with some supporting knowledge. So you can see here that I think this was Leah's answer. It says there that Mammy Harriet was known as Mammy Harriet, which means she was put in domestic service. Domestic service was usually less tiring than field work, and you were considered part of the wider family. So there's some supportive knowledge from our work on the plantations where this person's been able to bring in from their own knowledge some understanding as to why some people who were enslaved were treated differently to others. And if you remember, if you go back to that work, we looked at the different experiences of the so-called house slave and the so-called field slave. Okay, and then finally, we come on to question number 4. And again, I'm going to highlight that phrase in bold, your own contextual knowledge, but also where it says analysing quotes. All you need in this answer is content and knowledge for each interpretation. And that's the way that it's been set out. Before I go into what I believe is Damiana's answer, I want to say well done to those people who challenged the second paragraph that said, I find in this interpretation convincing, because you are able with one of the interpretations to say, actually, I don't find it that convincing at all, and here's why. And well done to those people that did that. So we can see here in Damiana's answer, we've got the 2 quotes. Interpretation A is convincing when it says that the hands are required to swallow their allowance of cold bacon. Now, you can see the knowledge there. It says we know that the enslaved needed to be there by 5:30 p.m. until 6 p.m, or else they would be whipped around 15 to 20 times. Now, we've got the supporting knowledge. One thing I would say there is we could make that quote a little bit more detailed and talk about making it link precisely to the knowledge, because the knowledge that's been provided is how long the work is. The quote actually just says that they don't get very long for their dinner. So I think a longer quote would have been good there, because it would have made that link between the quote and the supporting knowledge clearer. And then in the second one, it says interpretation B is convincing when it says master never said a word, we were never rushed. And then again, some really good supporting knowledge here. Life as a house servant was better than a plantation worker. They had to interact with the owners often, and then in brackets, for example, child caring, so the owner would trust them with their belongings. So I think this is a better example here of the supporting knowledge matching up with the quote that's been provided, because it says there, master never rushed us, he never said a word if we didn't get up. And here is an example from my knowledge of why people might be treated better than others on occasions. And then finally, I find A more convincing because you've identified correctly that it was before slavery was abolished, so excellent supporting knowledge there. It also says it was written from a past experience from an enslaved African. I think a lot of people mention this, but remember that both Mammy Harriet and Solomon Northup were enslaved. So they've both got first-hand experience. Yes, of course, Susan Smedes might be wanting us to think that enslavement was not as bad as you might first expect it to be. But where you've written, oh, this comes from someone who was enslaved, we need to be careful there, because they both were. They just have a very different view of it in their lives, their experiences, and in the work that they've created. So, for question number 3, my key target for people who did not receive full marks would be focus on provenance and make sure that you've got some supporting knowledge in the answer. For question number 4, I would say make sure that you're focused on content. Make sure that you've got precise supporting knowledge to back up the quotes, and that in the end you come to a clear judgment like Damiana has here.